welcome. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join me in this webinar. My name is Eric Benson. I'm a sales application engineer with Schneider Electric. Today we're going to be talking about hybrid system design and specifically targeting California. So let's go ahead and get started. So our agenda is going to be a short intro into XW Pro platform and our suite of products. We'll talk a little bit about California's public safety power shutoff program. We're going to have a load assessment, solar and storage assessment for designing around the needs of the customer. We'll talk a little about managing homeowner expectations, partial versus whole home backup, single phase and three-phase multi-unit systems. Schneider Electric Solar offers a complete suite of products that are proven to offer unparalleled reliability and versatility for residential and commercial applications. Our XW Pro is UL 1741 SA approved and has Rule 21 compatibility. XW Pro is an extension of the legacy XW and XW Plus models that have proven reliability in the field since 2006. Thousands of systems are still in operation today with no end in sight. Part of the reason is due to the isolated compartment for airflow, which is unique to the XW platform. Dust can accumulate on circuit boards over time and inhibit cooling of components. Some dust may even have conductive properties that may lead to premature failure. XW Pro boasts an 80-pound toroidal transformer that gives it such a robust surge capability, which is 12 kW for 60 seconds at 25 C. Toroidal transformers are more compact, more efficient, and offer less noise than a standard EI transformer. Not only can XW Pro provide a superior backup solution, you can reduce electricity costs by net metering, setting up for self-consumption, and peak shaving. XW Pro can do it all. Approved for UL 1741 SA and Rule 21, you have the perfect hybrid platform for designing around the needs of the customer. Here is the tail of the tape. Be careful when comparing to competitors' technical specifications, as some express peak power that is 1.4 times higher than RMS power, which actually does the work. Note the specifications for 120 volt, which are relevant for three-phase configuration with XW Pro. The limitation of 5.76 kW is due to the 60 amp breaker size when applying the 80% rule. NEC defines continuous as 3 hours or more, so you will be able to operate the rated 6.8 kW intermittently without nuisance tripping the breaker. Note XW Pro has power factor corrected charging. The 440 amp hour minimum is a carryover from the lead acid days. You can use smaller battery banks. Just make sure the bank is sized to safely accept all combined charging sources. All right, let's have a look at California's PSPS program. Many people that live in areas with a rock-solid grid take for granted that power will always be there. Since the Paradise tragedy, utilities are in the precarious position of choosing between reliable supply of energy or reduction of harm to those they serve. We always want to prioritize safety, but loss of power can have dire consequences as well, especially for those who have medical conditions and rely on electrically operated machines or refrigerated medicines. We should stress that XW Pro is marketed as a backup system. It is not a UPS. Although XW Pro has an industry-leading transfer to backup time of 8 milliseconds, which is virtually seamless, there may be a certain number of devices that see the interruption and reset, but this is rare. In California, efforts are underway to identify possible hazardous conditions and take action to mitigate risk. Weather is not always easy to predict, even with our existing capabilities. This means that despite their best efforts to give customers advance warning before a power shutoff, it could also provide very little warning. Strong offshore winds and dry conditions spell potential disaster for heavily forested areas that have distribution lines running through them. Thousands of small generators are being sold to provide temporary relief to customers that are without power. While this is one way to keep the lights on, generators are typically noisy and expensive to operate. The solution is to reduce or eliminate reliance on the public utility grid. Until recently, grid outages in California were extremely rare, and when they did occur, usually lasted less than an hour. Now the residents of California are being prepared for a, quote, new normal. Buying a small portable generator and running extension cords throughout your home can be dangerous. Many homeowners don't understand the hazards of using undersized conductors. With the understanding that PSPS events are here for the foreseeable future in California, customers may want to assess the long-term impact to their quality of life, eliminating risk factors, and those that will incur financial stress such as food spoilage. During initial consultation with the homeowner, find out if they're interested in just backup or whether they want to integrate solar. Does the customer want to back up only certain loads or the entire house? If a generator is not available, then ask how many days of autonomy is desired. Also determine whether cost is an issue. Federal tax credit of 22% is available for 2021, and incentives such as SCHIP can help lower the cost of storage, which is typically the most expensive part of the system. SCHIP currently provides a rebate of $200 per kilowatt hour. We are pleased to report XW Pro qualifies for SCHIP, by the way. Some municipalities also offer a $1,000 solar rebate, such as LADWP, and smaller utility companies in the Bay Area. Most customers just want to know that power will be there when they need it. Ideally, the customer won't have to do anything but enjoy safe, reliable, and uninterrupted power during PSPS. Whether designing a DC-coupled system or an AC-coupled system for new construction or as a retrofit, it is important to understand how the system will be used and follow certain basic sizing guidelines. We always start with the AC load. This is how to size the inverter charger system. Make sure the customer understands that higher demand loads such as air conditioners, electric range, electric dryer, devices such as these will require a larger system. Whatever the maximum number of devices that are likely to be running at the same time, the additive power of those devices must be considered for sizing the inverter system. All motor loads have a startup requirement that is several times the continuous rating. Sometimes locked rotor amps is provided in the spec sheet. Other times it might be on the motor nameplate. If locked rotor amps is not specified, you can usually find the LRA code and calculate startup current by the rated horsepower. In this case, the 1.5 horsepower motor has a LRA code of J, which provides a maximum value of 8 according to the chart. Locked rotor amps is 60.2 amps compared to the continuous rating of 13.8 amps. Not a very large surge requirement. If this were a 3 horsepower 230-volt single-phase motor with a locked rotor amp code of G, the locked rotor amps would be 47 amps and may be started with a single XW Pro. There are 2 types of overload protection in XW Pro, instantaneous and incremental. Each XW Pro can provide 52 amps of surge current. Each XW Pro can supply 8.5 kilowatts for 30 minutes. Larger loads can be sustained for shorter durations up to 12 kW for 60 seconds. These limits are at 25 C. Derating occurs at higher ambient temps. We do provide an overload chart based on ambient temp in the XW Pro manual. According to new California Fire Code guidance, PSPS has allowed a doubling of maximum battery bank sizes for residential storage systems, increasing from 20 kilowatt hours to 40 kilowatt hours for utility closets, and from 40 kilowatt hours to 80 kilowatt hours for attached and unattached garages. Time of use is a great way to reduce your electric bill by prioritizing stored energy during the more expensive rates and charge from the grid when the rates are lowest, or with solar. There is a risk of having an outage occur when the batteries are at partial state of charge, so you must weigh that risk and manage the customer expectations accordingly. For backup, it is really no different than off-grid. If a backup generator is unavailable, you need to carefully calculate the requirement for stored energy and the desired days of autonomy. This is where scaling factor and designing a system around the needs of the customer really come into play. Some applications require a lot of inverter power, but a relatively small amount of storage, while others require a significant amount of storage, but a relatively small inverter system. When scaling an all-in-one, you must usually increase the inverter capacity and the stored energy simultaneously, as their components are not sold separately. Remember, whether AC coupling or DC coupling, the battery should be sized at a minimum to safely accept the total amount of PV power. Creating a list of appliances with their respective watt ratings and hours of usage will give you total watts and energy requirements. In this case, the continuous power requirement slightly exceeds the 30-minute rating of a single XW Pro, which is 8.5 kW for 30 minutes. With load management, for example, making sure the range and the dryer are not used at the same time, a single XW Pro will provide enough backup power. Now let's talk about PV sizing. In this example, Madera, California has 6 hours of average solar installation from May through October, which is when PSPS events are most likely to occur. If we take our minimum requirement of 16 kilowatt hours per day to meet our load demand, we probably want a minimum of 3 kilowatts of PV after we account for efficiency losses. If you have sections of the roof at a non-optimal angle or has shading issues, you need to account for this by increasing your array size. You may consider ground mount if you have the space. Having a generator for worst-case scenarios is always a good idea. If the solar and storage is sized appropriately, the generator will rarely be called upon to start. Our AGS has a programmable exercise period that will keep the critical moving parts lubricated during periods when the generator is idle. The XW Pro platform works very well with generators. XW Pro has a separate input for grid and one for generator. Each has specific functions associated with them, so it isn't possible to export DC-coupled power to a generator. Now let's have a look at some possible configurations. Retrofitting existing PV systems is as simple as breaking the circuit between the PV inverter and the main service panel. Insert an XW Pro with a battery and a sub-panel for the backup loads. We have an AC coupling solutions guide on our website, sesolar.com, that provides guidance on AC coupling. The 2 rules of thumb are XW Pro watts and PV watts should be similar, and the battery must be sized at a minimum to accept the total PV. Here's an AC coupled system that is grid connected with a backup generator. The interlocked relay prevents the generator from being backfed with excess PV power. Some advantages of AC coupling are better efficiency when PV is supplying loads in real time, and it's easier to retrofit existing PV systems. Here's a diagram representing a DC-coupled system with partial home backup. DC coupling provides better efficiency when storing energy for use at a later time. It also allows a single monitoring platform to be used, namely Insight Local, to view the status of all Xanbus devices. Here's a DC-coupled system that is grid-connected with a backup generator. If the battery ever gets low, the AGS will automatically start the generator to get the battery charged. You can program to provide a partial charge, which allows PV to charge the battery fully. If the grid comes back while the generator is running, the generator will be stopped. Then the grid will be allowed to resume grid functionality. If the battery is still below the recharge setting, a charge will resume from the grid unless charging is blocked during peak hours. With notification of upcoming PSPS, you may wish to change how your system behaves. Thanks to Insight Cloud, these changes can be made remotely. For customers that do not have net metering agreement with their utility company, you can export PV and/or stored energy to reduce the upstream demand with our zero cell feature that utilizes an external meter and CTs to sense the amount of export power required without turning the meter backward. This is a great strategy for self-consumption. XW Pro is indoor rated. Any outdoor application will require a NEMA 3 or 4X enclosure while observing operational temperature range. It is important to remember the fan-cooled XW Pro has an exhaust vent out the top. It's therefore recommended to have sufficient clearance above these units so airflow CFM is not impeded. Keeping battery cables as short as possible reduces voltage drop. Plan the location of equipment carefully and keep the maximum inclusive Xanbus cable distance to less than 130 feet. If a load assessment reveals the switched current does not exceed 60 amps in a triple XW Pro system, you can allow AC pass-through to have full functionality of the system, including grid support and load shave. 60 amps is equivalent to 14.4 kW at 240 volts. A manual bypass switch can be used since there's no bypass interlock plate for a triple inverter system. Here's the system in normal operation. And here we see the loss of grid shifts all the load to the output side of the XW Pro system. Since you shouldn't pass through more than 60 amps with a multi-unit system, utilizing a whole house transfer switch will allow the cell power to offset grid demand and then switch the load to the output side of the inverter in a grid outage. Here's the normal operation, and here is the operation when the grid goes down. When installing an automatic transfer switch to solve the 60 amp pass-through, there are several off-the-shelf solutions that may be used, including Generac. Many customers choose the ASCO transfer switch because they are cost-effective and reliable. The fact that they are Schneider Electric is an added value. The Series 185 is the most basic model that lacks the programmability for specialized applications. When switching may need to be prioritized in a manner that is more complex, the Series 300 provides greater flexibility. If this were a 3 or 4 XW Pro system, the transfer relays for AC1 and AC2 would be protected. This system shows grid and a generator that is triple and will be transferring more than 60 amps. So when the grid is present, the AC loads are served directly and the demand is reduced by exporting PV and or stored energy. When the grid goes down, the ATS will switch to the backup position. The system will continue to run off the batteries until the grid comes back or until the batteries get low. When a low battery condition occurs, the generator is started. Make sure the ATS for the generator can have a delay in case the generator needs to warm up before picking up the load. The generator will run until the batteries are charged to the desired level, which is programmable. Then the generator will be stopped. The system will continue to operate like this until the grid returns. The XW Pro platform is scalable up to 4 units in single phase for combined power output when inverting, charging, and selling. Note the AC sync cables and Xanbus cables must be daisy-chained to all units in the system with only one master assigned and each with a different device number. For a 3-phase system, XW Pro requires 1 or 2 inverters per phase. A 3-inverter system supplies a nominal 20 kW, while a 6-inverter system provides 40 kW. Be aware that 2 XW Pros cannot recognize 2 lines of a 3-phase source. This question has come up a lot through the years. The 3-phase XW Pro system will have a common neutral. From line to line, you have 208 volts. From each line to neutral, you have 120 volts. Now let's focus on how everything physically connects together. Note the system has 0 clearance mounting capability with the power distribution panel to the far right. All knockouts are symmetrical, however, so mounting the PDP on the left or even in the middle if preferred. For single XW Pro systems, the Mini-PDP is a simple, cost-effective solution and easy to install. The AC breakers come pre-wired and labeled. The standard XW power distribution panel was originally offered with the legacy XW and XW Plus models and carried over to the XW Pro platform. The standard PDP provides enough AC breakers positions to accommodate a triple XW Pro multi-unit configuration and also provides positions for 8 panel mount DC breakers for the charge controllers. Note there is plenty of room for installers to get their hands in there. The PDP supplies a 250 amp DC breaker for a single XW Pro, 4 AWG cables that connect the DC bus in the PDP to the DC terminals on the bottom of the XW Pro. We provide Arctic UltraFlex number 6 AWG wiring for the AC input and output, and a conduit box that mounts just beneath the XW Pro. Part number is 865-1015-01. Adding a second inverter has been made easier than ever by offering kits that provide complete balance of system components. The 12240 breaker kit provides 3 2-pole 60 amp AC breakers, 4 power distribution bars, and a sliding bypass interlock plate. The connection kit provides an additional conduit box, which mounts beneath the XW Pro, the AC wires, the DC cables, a 250 amp battery breaker, and a larger DC positive bus plate. Here we have identified the AC terminals of a dual XW Pro system. The grid connection is made to the power distribution bars, which feed the 4 QOU 260 breakers, the 2 AC input breakers, and the 2 bypass breakers. And then likewise, you have the distribution bars that combine the load breakers to connect to the inverter's output terminals. The sliding bypass interlock plate is exclusive to dual XW Pro systems. It requires the operator to turn off both the load breakers, then slide the plate to the left to energize the bypass breakers. Here we have a triple XW Pro system represented. Note the absence of the bypass breakers. This is because we do not make a sliding interlock bypass plate for a triple inverter system. If you determine that your system is not going to violate the 60 amp limitation for a triple, then you can use a manual external bypass switch. But having bypass capability is highly recommended just in case. Oh, by the way, if you have an automatic transfer switch because your multi-unit system does exceed 60 amps, then it acts as a bypass because it normally defaults to the grid position. The PDP without AC breakers supplies a 250 amp DC breaker for a single XW Pro, a 4 AWG DC cables, and a conduit box. You may use the PDP part number 865-1015-01 if you're unable to locate the 1014 model through your distributor. The 1014 model is typically used for the 3-phase configuration. You just need to set aside the 3 QOU 260 breakers and use them for a different job. A connection kit will be needed for each additional XW Pro. This includes a 250 amp DC breaker, conduit box, DC cables, and the AC wires. The 3-phase breaker kit supplies 3 square D QOU 360 3-pole breakers, a set of power distribution jumpers for the AC bypass breaker, and a sliding interlock plate that prevents bypass and load breakers from being energized simultaneously. Each XW Pro ships configured for 12240 volt split phase by default. For a 3-phase system, each XW Pro must be converted to 120 volts. This is accomplished by installing the jumpers, 3 large and 1 small, that are supplied in the bag of hardware that ships with each XW Pro. The first step in 120 volt conversion is moving the transformer wires and installing the small jumper. Note the AC board is displayed with the location of the transformer wires identified. Next, the large jumpers are used to short L2 to neutral on the AC terminals. All neutrals on the AC board are common. As such, only one neutral connection is necessary on each XW Pro. From a hardware perspective, we now have a 120-volt inverter charger. Add Inside Home or Inside Facility to the Xanbus network and convert each XW Pro to 120-volt firmware. Xanbus is a daisy chain network, so make sure that you have your network terminators in place at either end of the Xanbus network. There's nothing special about Xanbus and sync cables. They're just simple Cat5 or Cat6e cables. If you have 4 XW Pros, that will take up a significant amount of bandwidth for a single Xanbus network. You'll easily have enough extra bandwidth to add a battery monitor, an AGS, and an SCP. However, you will not be able to add several charge controllers to the same Xanbus network as the quad stack. For large DC-coupled systems, such as this, use the secondary Xanbus network of Inside Facility, which will aggregate the devices from both Xanbus networks to a single web page on Insight Local and on Insight Cloud. Experience has shown a single Xanbus network can easily accommodate up to 3 XW Pro and up to 6 MPPT charge controllers plus accessories. A single Xanbus network can accommodate 6 XW Pros plus a battery monitor, AGS, and SCP when configured for 3-phase. XW Pro is the most robust and reliable platform on the market today. The versatility of this platform allows the exceptional installer to design a system around the specific needs of the customer. The XW Pro platform with Insight monitoring is the culmination of what our customers have been wanting for years, and other improvements are in the works. Thank you for taking the time to join this webinar.